Hi, this is Priyanka, and I welcome you all to Srijan Wednesday webinars. For those who are attending for the first time, this is a community initiative by Srijan Technologies. As a part of this initiative, we host webinars every alternate Wednesdays where we get speakers from different domains who talk on subjects like front-end technologies, UI UX, mobile apps, media, entrepreneurship, community building, digital marketing, and many more. Today we will learn about the key things about Drupal that you must know about. We will discuss how you can best leverage Drupal's capabilities and the Drupal community to help address business needs and mitigate risks. So without wasting any more time, I would now like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar. We have with us Kay von Wolkenberg, who is the founder and Chief Learning Officer of Own Sourcing, a Boston-based Drupal shop with a strong focus on training and mentorship. OnSourcing started in 2010 to deliver hands-on training and project-specific documentation to help organizations do great things with Drupal. Under the same aegis, Kay founded a mentorship program to help budding Drupal developers get their start. So while you get hooked on to Kay's presentation, don't forget to take this conversation live on Twitter using our hashtag SrijanWW. I repeat, it's hashtag SrijanWW. You can share your thoughts by tagging us and Own Sourcing in your tweets using your handles @Srijan and Own Sourcing. Without taking up any more time, I think we should get started. Kay, over to you.
Thanks very much, Priyanka, and I'm really pleased to be addressing this group. It sounds like you've had some great conversations in the past, and you've definitely got a lot of those presenters' notions and recommendations in mind when putting together this presentation. Our usual mode of communication is usually quite interactive, and so one of the things I'm hoping we can do is move through some of these concepts relatively quickly so that we have a common understanding of what we mean by the different notions and recommendations, and then perhaps relatively quickly go to discussion so that we can get the questions that broad groups of people are interested in having answers to. Almost inevitably, the question that one person has that they think might, not be of interest to anyone else is actually the most compelling question, as I'm sure everybody on this webinar has seen in the past. So, in any case, we're taking on a relatively broad topic and boiling it down to 5 things. 5 things decision makers should know about Drupal, where C-suite input on web apps is crucial. We've been presenting decision maker training for quite a number of years now, and almost inevitably get the question of, why would this audience get involved in something that is so focused on the technologist type of decision making? But the truth of the matter is that technologists, in many organizations don't take part in forming and really digging through the key strategies of a given organization. Frequently, they're actually even relatively junior folks, especially given that the web is, a relatively new focus for a lot of organizations, and potential employees are generally in a younger generation. It's actually quite important, we feel, and see the results very often, of mixing business strategy very thoroughly with the web development effort. And we see a lot of failed projects when you talk to various Drupal shops. I think you'll find, or you may have a Drupal shop yourself, that a very large percentage of new projects that come to Drupal shops are actually failed projects. Maybe they failed with Drupal, maybe they failed with a different technology. There are certainly lots of ways to fail. Sometimes those failures are due to technical mistakes, but very frequently those failures are actually due to decision-making errors. So this is our way, I think, of helping introduce the notion, or at least support the notion that really the business decisions need to be very thoroughly integrated into the decisions during project development. And so we'll go over some of those decisions today. In fact, the 5 specifically, and there are many, but 5 that seem particularly fertile for today are talking about structured content. This may be a phrase that people are becoming more familiar with, but we'll break out what people generally mean by structured content, and some of the pitfalls and opportunities, some of the insights that require kind of a broader view of corporate strategy or of organizational strategy in order to have a successful structured content strategy, or just content strategy. We'll also talk a bit about integration with applications. As the web matures, I think integration has become both more important strategy-wise and harder to avoid. I think previously, web properties were considered quite independently of each other, or independently of other efforts to produce business processes or content, or any of these areas of concern that people are looking to for the web now. Integration, well, we'll break it out further, but it certainly is a key concern for a lot of organizations. Maintainability is an area that in some cases is affected by stylistic choices, but frequently the choices that affect maintainability are made perhaps without a full awareness of the implications. Usually projects go very much on the momentum of the notion of new development, new features, new audiences, and the notion of post-launch can at times be left behind. Organization-wide adoption is a particular focus of ours, and the basic premise around organization-wide adoption is the notion that the web really no longer has the successful models that depend on a single webmaster, let's say, to use the old term. The expectation and the opportunities really do lie in having a broader set of contributors from organizations to the value that's presented on the web, whether that's business processes or information or engagement with communities, or quite a long list of ways that various members in an organization can contribute to the value of a web platform. And then the final item is suitability of technology. I think that frequently we actually see this 5th item really kind of taking the lead in a lot of decisions, and I suspect that it actually is appropriately among the last considerations that people should take on. And certainly when thinking about suitability of technology, we are specifically focused on Drupal and a Drupal ecosystem, which has quite a number of additional libraries and such that we incorporate. So I'll talk a little bit about how Drupal, what criteria might help you select Drupal appropriately, or perhaps choose not to use Drupal in a situation where that wouldn't be appropriate. So that's a quick rundown of the intention for the next handful of slides, and we can kind of break out some of the specific points on each. Please feel free to note your questions in the meantime. I don't believe they'll actually come to me, but it'll be great to have them for the discussion period at the end. So structured content. It's hard to know just how how much familiarity people have with this notion already. It's certainly one of the very strong abilities of, with Drupal. You're almost not using Drupal as intended if you're not actually thinking through structured content. And structured content, in effect, probably the most useful illustration is to compare the notion that we had with HTML in its kind of nascence, where really all of our content was kind of considered as one blob, one container, and we really only structured it for presentation purposes. So on this page, for example, you can see some different font sizes and colors and things like that. That kind of visual presentation really was our sole concern for years and years with building websites. It's worth noting that the opportunity to share data has really taken off, both sharing it within an organization across applications and sharing it outside of the organization in ways that it's reusable, again, within the organization or outside of the organization. Making this content reusable really requires some clarity around the intent of the content. So to give an example, a fairly simple one, if you visit the New York Times, it's fairly easy to spot quite a bit of structured content there. Their primary notion when publishing is of an article with a title and a byline. And structured content will allow you to, let's say, click on the byline and see additional articles written by that particular author, or click on a tag, a category, and see other things tagged that way. It's a very basic notion, a very early notion of structured content. So the primary strength that we are leveraging in projects that we're building around structured content tends to be relationships, the ability to create relationships. So in a normal business situation, there may be publicly facing information that's backed up by information that perhaps doesn't get shared publicly. So you might have, let's say, a data spec or a product specification that's put out to the world, and there's quite a bit of research that goes into that product and perhaps other products. We can, with a good structured content strategy, identify the pieces of research that would apply, that would have multiple relationships apply to a number of products, for example, and treat that piece of research as its own self-contained entity, so that we can then liberally create relationships between it and any of the products that it applies to. This allows us, when this research entity changes, to change it in one place and to have those changes propagate, in this example, to all of those products. So it's quite a powerful set of tools once you start digging into structured content. So I've broken out many of these slides into the purpose of the particular concern, the process for really leveraging it, the risks that need to be mitigated over the course of the effort, and then the metrics for judging the success. The purpose really ultimately comes down to having consistent information everywhere. So that when you change something in one place, that presentation or the effects, the calculations that are based on it, or whatever those things might be, propagate everywhere. And you're able to determine how those items are displayed, how they're accessed, how they are manipulated, what relationships they have, and so on. So quite a broad set of advantages in thinking through your structured content. The process for getting it is also relatively straightforward. The actual direct involvement of the C-suite around process tends to be along the lines of sharing insights and confirming understandings, usually at a relatively high level. A term that we often use in our projects, and I think is quite broadly used, is product owner. And so to have a senior person in the role of product owner, or at least taking part in the product ownership effort, is quite powerful. These can take place in relatively brief discovery sessions, review sessions, demonstrations, and so on. So the process that you can at least expect is taking place, and should give an opportunity, for this to take place, should support it as a senior member of an organization, is to audit the existing content and requirements. Ideally, the executive brief is quite clear on what you have and what shape it's in, and what your content requirements are, who your stakeholders are, and how they access it and interact with the information or the processes that are represented by it. And this list of requirements, generally, in a successful content strategy, will consider multiple devices. It will consider multiple channels, including print, including other perhaps video asset management and things along those lines. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about integration. So being aware of what's available, providing appropriate priorities, and helping tease out relationships can be something that is generally delegated but needs confirmation. Developing and testing the schema, the plan for creating content relationships is another opportunity for insights and adjustments, and the perspective of a senior person. One of the points that we make frequently and recognize maybe a stylistic point is to use the structured content analysis schema and so on actually as a starting point for your user experience design. This is a lot less common currently than we expect it to be, let's say, in a couple of years. I think it's a best practice that probably will really take over current practices. I think one of the downsides of starting kind of a traditional starting point, which generally is with Photoshop or Illustrator, to kind of break out visual assets and layout and considerations along those lines, is that content strategy might be overly limited by the visual presentation, and the visual presentation may be accomplishing, in turn, a relatively limited set of strategic objectives. So we find that really starting with content, and again, Drupal lends itself quite well to this approach, starting with content, getting a sense of how these relationships are playing out and how people are going to interact with them, and then in the course of this effort to actually then start working with the visual design tools and the experience design tools. That seems to lead to a bit richer understanding of how the content and the processes are going to be engaged with. So certainly demoing and testing this routinely is quite important. as with any kind of fast-moving, constantly changing project. There certainly are high risks that complexity and inflexibility will be introduced in these stages when working with content, that goals are overly ambitious, that you know, the desire to kind of cover everything takes over the discipline in, you know, choosing priorities and setting achievable objectives. So it's certainly something to help set, to help determine, and help shepherd. Performance and security hurdles are also a reality when integrating different applications that might have different ways of controlling access, or, you know, the display might have you know, complex set of limitations on who should see information and things along these lines. So there's certainly areas that need attention, and areas that you know, people have you know, reliable success with. It's not the set of risks that you're almost inevitably falling into, but certainly needs attention and prioritization. So some of the upsides that structured content can lead to certainly are reusability, broad reuse of your content, and I think when you can see the results of, you know, the same content being edited in one place, the relationships between those between pieces of content, you know, surfacing the information that people are actually after, or the processes that they're actually after. This type of reuse is certainly a great way of accelerating things like knowledge sharing and content auditability, and certainly search engine optimization as well. So integration overlaps quite a bit with this notion of structured content, of in effect labeling and labeling what the piece of content should consist of and should do, and then making those labels available to other applications that need to interact with it. Certainly some high-profile integrations, some integrations that are almost de rigueur, are with a CRM and a content management system, a relationship management system and a content management system. So Salesforce is quite frequently requested, or Sugar CRM, or some of these that are some of the open source options that are available. Again, you know, the process consists of an audit of what exists. And certainly anybody who is concerned about search engine optimization is aware of the notion of canonical sources. This notion of canonical sources reaches quite a bit further than just search engine optimization. It also will determine what source is referred to when changes are made, or when new calculations need to be run. And who has access to those sources, what type of access, how can they affect the data, how can they affect the relationship or the process. There's a fairly common term that I'll break out just in case this isn't a familiar one, API, Application Programming Interface, which allows different web properties and non-web properties to communicate with each other, not only in the exchange of information, but also for initiating processes as well. And the API gets a fair amount of attention in the technology world and may not be quite as clear to the leadership set. I think that it's an area that some awareness, you know, some familiarity is certainly useful, but it doesn't need to be, thoroughly unpacked, I think. Suffice it to say that in order to understand integrations, some notion of the processes that need to take place and what web property is going to handle what process can help as you review and as you recommend adjustments or evaluate outcomes. Again, like with content strategies, the risks often come down to excessive complexity or to inflexibility, to making something that doesn't have an eye to the almost inevitable need for change and for clarity. So certainly when requesting features, there's an opportunity to determine whether a feature is critical to the success of a particular integration, or whether that feature might be lower priority and perhaps, especially during the development process, left out initially, so that the critical parts of the integration can be evaluated with a bit greater clarity and simplicity before introducing additional layers. Performance and security hurdles are relatively significant in this case. Again, possible to avoid falling into untenable situations, but it requires resources and attention and prioritization. And again, like with content strategies, the greatest metric of success is the broad reuse of information. We can certainly, after running through these concepts, dig out a couple of examples of successful integrations and how they've played out. One of our top concerns, well, I suppose these are 5 top concerns, but certainly maintainability, I think I mentioned just a moment ago, sometimes takes a back seat to the excitement around new features and the development. One of the things that I think we're going to see quite a bit more of is the adoption of existing code libraries and sharing really among open source communities. It'll be interesting to see how this practice evolves. I would say that it's still quite early in its existence, even though open source software has existed for quite a while. I think we're still working out quite a few of the best practices and how we deal with, how we mitigate risks and leverage our resources best. But certainly when you're thinking about shared libraries, for example, with Drupal, or there are quite a number of front-end libraries as well. Angular is one, a JavaScript library that's getting quite a bit of attention. These libraries inevitably need adaptation to your requirements, but the adaptation in many cases can take place without removing the opportunity to apply security releases or feature releases in the future. It takes a specific set of skills, again, a set of skills that are left to technologists. However, recognizing the importance of maintaining the upgrade path certainly can help with prioritizing various concerns during the development process. So I suspect that upgrade path is not clear at a glance. The reason that it's important isn't necessarily clear after a short description, and so we can certainly dig into that concept a little bit more as well. But certainly among the criteria that you are keeping in mind when judging the success of a project in development, and certainly a question that can be asked really at each demo, is what does this mean for us? What does this particular feature mean, or this particular effort mean to our ability to adopt upgrades in the future? Do we still have an upgrade path? I've mentioned the notion clean room in the same line. It's a term that I think I've been hearing some traction around, and we may have picked it up someplace else, or we may have actually coined it. But the notion really is that development can get quite messy. One of our own strategies for preserving upgrade path is to let development take its messy form in in local repositories and in development repositories. But then we have a variety of strategies for ensuring that the experimental side of development is actually thoroughly tested before it's integrated into our production site. It's been an interesting process. It certainly has some downsides. The upside for us has been a bit higher predictability around behavior, a bit lower introduction of bugs, and this is an ongoing battle, a constant battle, and we expect to be able to continue improving this process and learning from other people who are following it or different processes as well. Deferred decisions is a notion that really comes from Agile and is, again, perhaps a stylistic choice. Certainly some development teams prefer not to adopt Agile or to adopt a particular homegrown version or, not quite as broadly adopted version of Agile. But deferred decisions are certainly something for us that we tie directly to the maintainability of a project. And basically what it means is that we'll start with broad brushstrokes in what we believe our understanding of required feature is. We won't try to get all of the details. We'll try to create something that's user testable, something that we can use to improve our understanding of project requirements in very concrete ways, with observing users or fielding requests or those types of things. And every decision that we can delay while still gathering good information about the requirements of the project, we will. So again, very much a stylistic choice. There are lots of schools of thought that say while you're working in a problem space, you should accomplish all of the objectives of that problem space before moving on to another problem space, which certainly also has upsides. The reason that you might want to be aware of this as a strategic member or a decision maker on a team is that if the expectation of the measurement of project success is to see these details in place, and your requests are specifically around seeing those details. In some cases, again, it could be a stylistic decision. In some cases, that may lead to a little bit of a sham effort. Perhaps that sounds too pejorative. But let's say, for example, during demo, it's important to the stakeholders to see something that looks attractive and something that has, let's call it feature complete, that has all of the aspects of the feature that we'd like to see. When setting that type of expectation, the tendency is quite high to introduce workarounds. We can't quite theme this yet, but we're going to make it look nice, and then we'll have to deal with we call it technical baggage after the demo, which may mean that we'll tear it out, or it may mean that we'll build additional work-ons on top of that workaround. So deferred decisions certainly is something that's worth discussing with your team. When we come into demo, what types of things should we expect to see that move the project forward versus what types of things can you show us to persuade us that you're talented and moving at a high velocity. And I think it's a useful conversation. Obviously, you need reassurances that things are on track. But perhaps can come up with an agreement with the development team to ensure that that when you're reviewing things, you understand whether it's a final product or whether details are still to come, and to understand what type of feedback will be useful. User testing, I think I described sufficiently. It's I think a key part of any project, and certainly becomes a primary guideline for deferring a decision or not deferring a decision on how a feature is going to be presented. I'll talk a little bit more about release cycles when talking about criteria for selecting Drupal. But suffice it to say that the notion of deferred decisions leads to partial builds, which can be referred to as prototypes, where you have a select set of features that are ready for review and testing. These can often be built very rapidly. In some cases, it's a matter of minutes. In some cases, it's days. But it's generally for the purpose of discovery. We find it, again, it's a stylistic decision. We find it quite a powerful tool. It lets us then graduate from a series of focused understandings to data which combines those different notions, and certainly there's an alpha cycle in there as well, but the beta cycle is intended to be feature complete, ready for release to a limited group, and probably still has quite a bit of the flexibility preserved in it, where we perhaps aren't making decisions quite yet about performance, scalability, perhaps even some of the higher challenges around access and permissions and roles and things along those lines. Still with opportunities for taking feedback. This relates to maintainability largely in that the style that we've adopted to this point, to the point of beta, really does assume that things are unoptimized, and that some of the things that we might need to do in, let's make a distinction with Drupal between code and configuration. Things that we might need to do in code but can do in configuration, we will choose the more flexible of the two choices. This is important to understand in part because in the effort to preserve upgrade path, beta usually means that, for us, that, and I think for other people who adopt this particular strategy, that there's a fair amount of work that needs to take place between the beta and the broad release, not just the inclusion of new requests and features or new understandings, but optimization, producing things that, making trade-offs really between the upgrade path, the opportunity to adopt a library that has new features, and on the other hand, the need to do quite a bit of work in order to adopt new features or new security. Actually, I guess the point that I want to actually make among the criteria for selecting Drupal or not selecting Drupal really is, when the library in and of itself provides a large amount of value to you. When the library in and of itself provides a large amount of value to you, you probably want to preserve as much of that all the way through beta as possible. And at the production point, it's important to continue thinking strategically about the trade-offs, about whether the production version is going to really become a fork of the project, as it were, and become code that really is specific to your project and no longer as closely related to the community's effort. So adoption, and I'm actually going to use this to wrap up, I think right here so that we can get to questions. Adoption is a consideration, again, that's frequently left behind. Frequently the assumption during development is there's an ideal user, an ideal contributor who's going to go from first seeing the product or the platform to using it fully. And certainly one of the efforts that we think is key to the success of a project is recognition of the stages that various stakeholders will pass through in their adoption. A key piece of that really is familiarity, and often being shown the ropes by a colleague or perhaps attending a formal training. And then, you know, also very, very key in adoption is, you know, for responsibilities to be conveyed, for style choices, for guidelines to be conveyed in context, available to everyone, so that as they are producing value on the web, they have a reference that helps them ensure, or really to steward, the value of the website. Some simple examples certainly could be font choice, where the attractiveness of a site degrades as individuals make their own font choices. It's a little bit of a silly example, but it certainly extends to, you know, if you're introducing business processes, that they be introduced in a consistent manner, and a guide is quite key. And having that guide immediately available to people as they contribute to the site is quite important. There's quite a bit to say also about access as part of adoption, but I think that, again, we can get to that a little bit more during the discussion. So Drupal is certainly not a panacea, you know, the perfect fit for all projects. I don't believe that anyone would ever think it was. So sometimes within the community we get quite enthusiastic about just how powerful it is and how broadly it applies. But I wanted to break out just really quickly a couple of the considerations that are worth having top of mind when reviewing possible approaches to producing your web app, your platform, your web property. One of the strengths that Drupal has that certainly can become a bit of a weakness in some situations is it has a very powerful permissioning architecture. It's great for being able to give people relatively fine-grained permissions. It's not as fine-grained as some projects require. But you can get quite complex in controlling what users can see and do on a Drupal website. In some cases, the demands of managing that outstrip the benefits that an organization might be looking for, and you know, so certainly an overpowered user management system may not be appropriate in some situations. You know, if your business processes are complex and need constant adjustment, and the permissions need a high level of auditability, it may not be an appropriate fit. So on either end of this kind of sweet spot of, you know, quite a few ways of managing users, but in some cases that may be too much, and in some cases that may be too little. The architecture of Drupal is very, very flexible, but is not applicable to every web property. Databases, Drupal 7 currently relies on relational databases to a large extent. Databases in and of themselves can have significant implications around scalability or specific applications, and certainly the database layer is changing in Drupal 8, but when considering whether your application is a good fit for Drupal or not, it's quite important to understand if your application is something that is well suited to a database, a relational database, or in the future MongoDB and things along those lines. There are a variety of ways of storing data. The development cycle I mentioned both as a potential strength and a potential weakness. Libraries, just in general, are at times plagued by technical baggage, where there are features that you don't need and they're a bit in your way. So certainly that's something to consider. The level of complexity in the specific features that you need may be over-engineered, and you may find that you have a higher level of success by adopting a simpler architecture. Performance. Drupal does deliver some of the highest trafficked sites in the world, whether with logged-in users or not with logged-in users. There are certainly some great examples where Drupal would not be a particularly good fit, in part because of the user management requirements and the difficulty of scaling. Twitter is an example that people often pull off the shelf to say, well, you certainly couldn't build that with Drupal, and there's no debate there. But there are certainly some very powerful, high-performing websites built on Drupal that also rely on logged-in users or present data to anonymous users. I think when it comes down to security, roadmap, and community, those three wrap fairly nicely into each other. I think one of the biggest strengths of open source, just in general, is the ability to have a broad group of testers confirming that the code you're using is secure, and that the bugs, the feature bugs or bugs of any sort are spotted. Browser compatibility is certainly one that became a far less challenging requirement in projects with the adoption of Drupal. Drupal has a security team that is very active, and if you are currently using Drupal and not subscribing to the security announcements, I can definitely strongly recommend it. I think that we can probably touch on these other considerations better in discussion. So if it's all right, I'd like to pause the slides here and perhaps put it back on the overview and dive into discussion at this point.
Thank you so much, Kay, for sharing your presentation and your learning so far. I believe it's been a very interesting session so far, and as you said, it would make more sense if we can stop for question answers right now, since we're a little hard pressed on time here. So I will request all participants to please type in any questions that you have right now, so we can take them up. I believe we can just continue with your presentation for a while. Meanwhile, the participants would type in their questions. Would that be all right, Kay?
Sure. If someone wants to indicate an area that would be particularly useful to delve into deeper, that would certainly be a useful way to select where to continue.
Right. So as you can see, that Kay is very open to your inputs here, and would like to touch upon the topics that would matter most to you right now and would address your problem areas. I would please request you all to please share what what would you really like him to talk about right now, and what are the key challenges that you face while you're deciding on a CMS, or is there something particular that you'd like to know about Drupal?
So also recognizing that we went through this fairly quickly, in the meantime, I can of course also grab an area that I think is perhaps less immediately apparent. So, in fact, going back to the notion of roadmap, but I hope to be interrupted very soon, so that I don't drone on and on about.
I hope so
Uh,
too. Since we just have about 8 minutes left, I think
right.
suitability would be a great area to begin with, because a lot of people don't understand if Drupal, what Drupal does, and whether or not it fits with their requirements. So I think it will be a great area to start off with.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so certainly this notion that some strengths are weaknesses and some weaknesses strengths. The community has worked quite hard to ensure, a high level of flexibility and broad applicability. But I think in doing so, there's an ongoing debate within the community around the roadmap of whether the project is best served by including a lot of features within the core distribution of Drupal, or if it's better to have a small number of features. And I think, from a leadership perspective, one of the trade-offs that would make a lot of sense to be considering when discussing your strategy is whether part of your strategy involves adopting new technology rapidly. So certainly one of the strengths that Drupal has is that it has been at the forefront of quite a few powerful technologies, introducing them to the world, making them accessible to broad groups of developers who might not otherwise have been able to adopt them. At the same time, there certainly is a level of complexity that can be challenging to deal with. So a recent question that was brought up to me was whether a specific inventory system would be better built using a PHP framework that didn't have some of the bells and whistles of Drupal, or whether it would be suitable to do with Drupal. And part of the requirements of this inventory system were quite granular. It was quite a granular data model, in the sense that they had a lot of different criteria for and pieces of information that needed to be populated for each item in their inventory system. And building that in Drupal, while certainly possible, didn't appear to me to have advantages. They didn't have a requirement for granular access control. They didn't have a need for the latest social media features, or they didn't need to integrate this inventory system with legacy systems. They were basically building it to migrate data in, and certainly the level of complexity of making such granular distinctions looked to me like a bad fit for Drupal. I think Drupal, and I would imagine most content management systems, do best when there's a high regularity, a high repeatability of patterns. And when those patterns become quite irregular, that's usually an indication that Drupal is probably not as good a fit. The community brings quite a bit of standardization as well with it. I mentioned the Drupal security team, which is very active in defining best practices. and quite active in responding when a security issue comes to light. And so these are quite powerful and somewhat unusual advantages that Drupal has, but the trade-off in this particular case is that alteration kind of takes you out of that loop. Significant alteration. One of the strengths of Drupal is its ability to deal with overrides, where the existing contributed code or the contributed libraries can continue to maintain their original form, and then the alterations that are needed can be layered on top of it. So when you're thinking about whether Drupal is an appropriate technology to adopt, part of the strategic considerations are, do we have, is it a close enough fit to our use cases that we can do relatively minor alterations in order to preserve our upgrade path? On the other hand, if we do need to do significant alterations, can we do it in a way that we can keep enough resources on hand, to, in effect, handle the new development and the testing on that new development without the assistance of the community. So there are quite a number of trade-offs to consider. Many of them, again, handled by technologists, but frequently with strategic implications, looking 5 years out, or 3 years out, or a year out, and saying, these are the types of changes that we expect to come down the road, or we're actually not expecting too many changes. Those can be quite key factors in determining whether to depart from an upgrade path, whether to adopt Drupal at all, or whether to alter significant parts of Drupal and, in effect, use it as a platform that quickly becomes a bespoke platform. So I'm quite happy to loop back to other topics. I'm assuming that you'll interrupt me, Priyanka, if a question does come through.
Right, we actually do have questions, and although your presentation, I believe, is very interesting and extensive, I would, really apologize, and I would hate to say that we would have to sort of cut it short. But I would still like to take up the two questions that we have received from our participants today. Our first question is from Ashutosh. He wants to know, how will you advocate performance of Drupal as compared to other frameworks?
Performance. So between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, there is a fairly significant change, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Drupal 8 is still in early development, and so the performance considerations are still being understood and developed. So it'll be a very big and interesting change. Drupal 7, there are some notable high-profile, high-performant examples with Drupal 7. It generally requires a fairly robust caching strategy, and so I would say that in most situations, I don't think that the need for high performance would necessarily be a factor in choosing whether you go with Drupal or not. Not in many situations, just that consideration by itself. I think that there are probably quite a number of other factors. What does your caching expiration opportunity look like? What things need to be able to expire quickly? Are they parts of the page? Drupal 7 has a bit of a challenge with that. So I think that it's probably so much of a case-by-case basis for answering questions about performance. I think ultimately it comes down to Drupal requires pretty good understanding of caching. If you have experts available to you in that area, I think you can probably expect to accomplish an awful lot with Drupal, and it would compare very well to other platforms.
Right. Thank you so much, Ashutosh. I hope it answers your question. If you have another follow-up question, please feel free to type in. Meanwhile, Kay, we have received another question, but I wanted to ask if you'd be interested in, completing your presentation if you need a few more minutes. But since we are already past the, time duration of a webinar, I would request you to keep it really short and crisp. Would that be possible?
Yes, please. Yeah, we'll take on the question, and I think we can probably close on it.
All right. So the other question is very interestingly on security. In fact, both the question are on Drupal security. So one of them is that while selling Drupal, a lot of our clients are very particular about security and skeptical about it being an open source CMS. So how do we address such challenges when security is concerned?
Yeah, I suspect that security is only going to become a bigger thorn in our sides, and I suspect that there will be some relatively catastrophic security incidents in the not so distant future. The debate about whether open source or closed source provides a better avenue is certainly an interesting debate, and I feel underqualified to say anything, fresh or succinct, about what the outcome is going to be. There have been some very high-profile disappointments with open source security in the recent past. It's an awfully hard one. I think at least the debate, some of the salient points from the debate are with a closed source, with proprietary software. There are fewer opportunities for people actually to be aware of the nature of their security risks. There are few opportunities for security audits. Whether those are good or bad, I've certainly phrased them as in, with a preference for openness and the ability to read and study the source. But whether those ultimately are good or bad, I think is going to be an awfully hard final call to make. But I think that there's no doubt we need to pay a lot of attention to it, a lot more attention than has been given. And I think the fact that world leaders are talking about cybersecurity is a good sign. I think, with Drupal's ability to develop rapidly, I would expect it to be able to address challenges quickly as they come up.
All right. Thank you so much, Kay. I hope you have answered your Ashutosh's question very well. Our next question is again by Ashutosh. The earlier one was, sorry, by Akhil. This one is by Ashutosh, who wants to know, how will you advocate performance of Drupal as compared to frameworks? Like, okay, so we have already taken this. I'm so sorry for all the confusion. We actually have repeated questions here. So our last question here is by Umar, who wants to know, how do we showcase security rating of Drupal to our clients that expect close to zero tolerance security issues?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that there are probably very few people who advocate for Drupal as a zero tolerance solution. I say that cautiously. Um, I suspect that the question has more to do with, the notions of security. Certainly a a project that doesn't contain personal information doesn't need security measures around personal information. However, that type of access control with Drupal has been shown to be quite robust. Drupal is in some situations where expectations around security are quite high, to the best of my knowledge, though not in some of the places that are susceptible to very sophisticated attacks. One exception, of course, is whitehouse.gov is run on Drupal. It's worth noting that the security breach that the White House experienced was of their internal systems, to the best of my knowledge, not whitehouse.gov. And so I imagine that that's quite a high-profile target that it appears to stand up to quite well. Whitehouse.gov also, to the best of my understanding, has some alterations and policies that are probably unique in their implementation. But if people are considering, for example, a financial application, I think that that's something that, again, you should hire people with specific expertise in the vulnerabilities that can be introduced with, storing information or passing through information. How to sell security around Drupal, I think, ultimately boils down to Drupal's record of closing down security issues and rapidly addressing areas of concerns, defining best practices. I think, unlike quite a large range of other projects, I think Drupal has been able to eliminate some fairly common forms of breaking into breaking into web properties. I suspect that the answer is a case-by-case basis. What are the areas of specific concern with security? If it comes down to the security of the database, if it comes down to the thoroughness of the code reviews and the testing and things like that, I think Drupal has a very high success rate and a very compelling story around how well the API sanitizes information and prevents unauthorized access. That's one type of security concern.
All right. Thanks a lot. That was the last question for today. If you guys have any more questions, feedbacks, or suggestions for us, please drop a mail to us at webinars@srijan.in. We'd really love to hear from you all. And Kay, would you like to continue with your presentation very quickly? So anyway, we are already 10 minutes past our scheduled time.
No, I think really, ultimately, that's a reasonable place to start. I think, the kind of final parting statement comes back to this question of what types of trade-offs are made and what role should senior team members play in those trade-offs. And I think ultimately it comes down to aligning this business strategy with the technology choices and ensuring that at each point in the process, the leadership team has an opportunity to ask why, to continue asking why until they feel there's a solid match with the organization's broad strategies, and that, frankly, these types of reviews can look an awful lot like the development of a strategy more broadly. They can take the form of questioning assumptions, overturning, incorrect understandings, and reviewing outcomes, making adjustments as as a result of feedback. So I'm certainly interested in continuing the conversation if anyone would like to. And
Thanks a lot, Kay.
happy to take any additional.
Yeah, I would suggest going to the last slide so people can actually reach out to you after the webinar if they have any more questions for you, or they can directly connect if they need more help on the subject. I would once again like to thank you on behalf of our entire community, Kay, for leading such a knowledgeable session. We are very sure that everybody found your presentation very interesting and insightful, and these are very important things that people should ideally know about Drupal. And I'm pretty sure that people would now, these learnings would now help everybody, all of our participants, in the decision making process. A big thank you to all the attendees for joining us today. Before we close today, I would also like to announce that our next webinar, titled Client Wrangling Your Way to Great Projects, would be hosted on the 10th of June and would be led by Susan Rust, who's a Drupal business consultant at Drupal Anywhere. For registrations and more details, you'll be getting a mail from our side. So stay tuned, and thank you again for joining us today.